and along with Ross Strategic, co-facilitate the Transformational Change Learning Partnership. It's a partnership of around 450 individuals, 150 institutions, really exploring the notion and implications of transformational change. In this particular webinar, we're going to explore how multi-stakeholder finance models can drive rapid and just responses to the climate crisis. So if you've come here wanting to work out how all the different sources of finance, all of us collectively, can work together and achieve what we really can't achieve alone, then you're in exactly the right place. So before we introduce too much of what we'll be doing together, I'm going to hand back to Katira just to cover a couple of housekeeping suggestions as we start up. Katira, over to you.
Hello. All right, so I just wanted to inform you all that this meeting is being recorded so that you all can we can share it with participants later. Also a reminder, please mute your microphone while others are speaking, otherwise we'll get a lot of background noise.
Project like this.
Like sometimes that happens.
Within the organization.
Currently. Please raise your virtual hand to contribute to the conversation. If you're on a PC, you can do Alt-Y, or if you're on a Mac, you can do Option-Y. Please allow a chance for everyone to speak and listen actively to understand others' views. And if you have any tech issues, please, I've got a little wrench next to my name for tech, so you can message me directly, or at the bottom of your screen, there's also a ask for help, and that'll go directly to me. All right, I'll pass it back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Katira, and a big welcome again to those of you who have just joined. People are still coming in, so yeah, a big welcome, and I think an exciting program with representatives from two large climate investment funds who have been working with the private sector, representatives from the philanthropic community, and others who can share labor perspectives. So I think a really diverse range of perspectives to explore the following three objectives of this Transformational Climate Finance webinar. The first objective really is to have a look at how can transformational change concepts, so the kind of work that's been going on in the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, help us to shape and to use key levers. And by levers, we mean things like policies, standards, partnerships, different kinds of models, different financing mechanisms, to rapidly scale financing for transformational climate action. So that's the first one, and just now Nasibe will introduce some of the transformational change concepts and some insights that we're developing in this area of work around transformational climate finance. The second objective is to really to share recent efforts and perspectives from key institutions to transform and scale the impact of climate finance. And we really invite all of you as participants to feel very welcome to share some examples of your work, to use those examples to shape the kinds of questions that we pose into the institutions that we brought together on the panel. And the third objective is really to understand how different sources of capital can work together with private capital, recognizing the enormous quantum of private capital potentially available to support both a large-scale and just transformational climate action. So those are our three objectives. We look forward to kind of exploring them together and to really opening up some discussion on each of those. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Nasibe to open up first of all, some idea of the transformational change concepts, and then secondly, some insights from a previous webinar that we had that really explored what this transformational finance was, as we start to shift in this webinar into how we do it and how we can work together to leverage climate finance. So Nasibe, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. As Mike mentioned, and as some of you are aware, if you have been following the TCLP webinar series, as you know, the TCLP started in around 2017, and the idea was to work towards a better understanding and to better conceptualize and assess transformational change. And this included developing a framework with a definition of transformational change, which is the one that you're seeing on the screen. And if we move on to the next slide, we also worked towards dimensions and signals of transformational change. This is a work in progress, and we have been, for the first 2 years, we worked on a more conceptual side of it. But since last year, the focus has shifted towards a more practical work to operationalize transformational change within investments and projects, and also to develop practical guidance for program designers and implementers. And as part of these efforts, if you move to the next slide, last December, the TCLP organized a webinar that explored how philanthropy and private sector and multilateral institutions could collaborate to scale up finance and also to contribute to transformational climate action. We had over 80 participants, around 80 participants, and a lot of the discussion showed how, even though it is widely accepted that finance is a key element to achieve global commitments for climate change and low carbon development, still the available resources for climate action are not nearly enough. They are around 1/10 of what is needed to reach these high-level goals. So by addressing these challenges during the webinar, we also identified a few pathways to overcome them. First and foremost, the resources that are available at the moment, they need to be deployed in strategic ways that favor an approach that is systemic to achieve transformational results. Also, we learned that we need to keep, as if you didn't know, we need to keep pushing to make climate finance a global priority over other activities that are more carbon-based. Can we move on to the next one, please? Another takeaway was that for some stakeholders that are involved in climate finance, like private sector, for example, we need to secure their commitments through accountability mechanisms that ensure that their support actually contributes to our global efforts. But overall, there was wide agreement on the transformational capacity of having all of these actors collaborating with one another, playing their strengths and addressing each other's risks, working together with innovative financial mechanisms, blended finance, for example. And this can actually bring about this urgent scaled up action that is needed to tackle the current climate crisis. I'm gonna stop here, but if you want to watch a replay of the webinar or read more about it, you're gonna find the link on the chat box around now, I think. And I'll hand it over to you, Tim, to talk about the poll.
Good. Thanks very much, Nasibe. And just going to very quickly introduce the poll. And the poll is, I think, really just a way of making sure that everybody who's in this session is concentrating and focused. So the poll really tests some of the concepts and tests some of the ideas that Nasibe has been sharing. It doesn't actually. It asks you a question to answer entirely from your own experience. So what is the one thing that needs to happen in order for climate finance to become more transformational? Really feel free to share your own opinion. It will, I think, ask you for your name. That name won't show up next to your answer. But maybe I will also just hand over to Kutira just to introduce some of the technicality of the poll, how you get in there, and then I'll pick up some commentary on the results coming in. Kutira, anything else you'd like to cover?
Yes, so if you go to the website listed here in step 1, there's also a link in the chat that Janelle just posted. You'll just be prompted to enter your name. I recommend if you want to write more than one word, please hyphenate your phrases so that they stay together. Otherwise, it will end up as separate words. All right, and let's take a look at our poll and see how it's coming in. And I'll pass the mic back to Mike.
Thank you. It is almost stating the obvious, isn't it? That that the one thing that really is needed in order for climate finance to become more transformational is to have the climate finance in the first place. So I think absolutely, it's about leveraging the climate finance, accessing it from different sources, and making it available in the places where it's needed. The scaling obviously is a big one. There's been a lot of discussion around the scale of climate finance since before the $100 billion was kind of promised. How do we scale climate finance? How do we bring multiple forms of climate finance in? So that is a key one. I suppose the focus of that finance. So in many instances we see the finance coming in, but it may be focused, for example, on a narrow energy transition that may not address some of the big climate issues necessarily. Often also doesn't address local issues. So I see the local coming in there. Many different perspectives. If I watch this too long, I get seasick. But I think some really useful ideas and ideas that we will explore with the panel. So I'm going to hand it over now to Tim Larson, the president of Ross Strategic, who's our key partner or key partner of the climate investment funds in the co-facilitation of the Transformational Change Learning Partnership. So Tim, I'm going to hand it over to you to both introduce the speakers, but also to facilitate what I'm sure will be a really rich and transformational discussion. So Tim, over to you, and thank you to everybody who contributed into the poll. Some really nice ideas there. We'll explore them as well after the webinar. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mike. It's really a pleasure to be here and thrilled to have this really amazing panel that I'll introduce now. What we're going to do is similar format to last December, where I'll be in dialogue and discussion with our four panelists today for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussions from other participants in the webinar, and then move to wrap up. So with that, Kira, can you please bring up the next slide, and I'll introduce our panelists today. First, we have Chris Head from the Climate Investment Funds. We also have Shilpa Patel, who's the Director of Mission Investing at Climateworks Foundation. Archie Rastogi, who's the Evaluation Advisor with the Independent Evaluation Unit at the Green Climate Fund, who's been recently completed an evaluation focused on private sector mobilization. And then also we have Camilla Roman from the International Labor Organization, who's been leading some exciting work on there on kind of engaging scaling of financing for social programs. And I think there's probably a lot we can learn from that. So welcome you all. We can take the introduction slide down now. I guess how I wanted to start off was just to create a little bit of space for each of you to just really briefly introduce yourself and give a little bit about kind of how you and your organization are kind of coming to this issue of trying to scale just climate finance, and to give a little bit of background on some of the things that you and your organization are working on. So I'll go through the first order of introduction here, and then we'll mix it up after this. So Chris, do you want to kick off?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Head. I'm a senior private sector specialist with Climate Investment Funds. For a bit of background on kind of who we are and what we do, the CIP were founded back in 2008 on a fairly simple premise. That large-scale concessional capital deployed through a partnership of multilateral development banks which are institutions with a long track record and kind of knowledge of developing economies. We could collectively catalyze transformational investments and help create new markets in alignment with development and climate goals. So as of now, we're investing more than $10 billion in capital, supporting around 350 projects across 72 developing countries. And these investments are drawing in a little bit over $60 billion in co-financing. So we provide financing at below market rates, often through concessional debt or equity, guarantees, and grants, generally on a fairly large scale. That's kind of what we bring to the table, is that we have targeted packages of risk-bearing capital that can support investment in technologies and operations that are often on the edge of commercial viability and try to bring those to scale. And by doing so, such investments can have a demonstration effect, reducing both the real and sometimes perceived risk of certain investments or certain sectors or technologies, and accelerate the shift in markets toward low carbon solutions. So approximately about a third of our portfolio is invested in the private sector, and we're looking to ramp that up under some of our new programs. And already we're expecting around 19, 20 billion in co-financing from private sector. So even though we have, I'd say, a fairly large portfolio, we know this is really just a drop in the bucket of the trillions of investments that's needed in this low carbon, climate resilient infrastructure and other investments. And so to mobilize the levels of funding we really need to look at key partners, private sector and others, to get to that scale we need. So I'll stop there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Chris. Shilpa, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Tim, and hello, everybody. So I work at Climateworks, which is a global philanthropic organization based in San Francisco that was created really to focus on climate change mitigation. At Climateworks, I work on finance mobilization using philanthropic support across the return spectrum. So that ranges from grants to mission investment. Now, we know that the needs for climate-related investment are in the range of 5 trillion a year by 2030, and that the bulk of this will have to come from the private sector. So how do we mobilize this funding? Now, I started working on climate finance back in 2004, and since then, I've been involved in some form of blended finance, even if we didn't call it that back then. I've worked at the World Bank and the IFC, first in mainstream investment, and then with multilateral climate finance mechanisms like the CIF, the GEF, and the GCF, as well as bilateral donors. And now I work in philanthropy. And really what excites me is the possibility of bringing these different sources of capital together to provide the support and structures that will crowd in private investment. And that is really a focus of a lot of my work here at Climateworks.
Great. Thank you, Shilpa. I'm going to turn now to Archie.
Thanks, Tim. Hello, colleagues. My name is Archie Rastogi. I am working currently as the evaluation advisor at Interim at the independent evaluation unit of the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund is one of the operating entities of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, as well as it serves the Paris Agreement. And it's one of the funds, the largest climate-focused multilateral development funds in globally currently, with a pretty large portfolio. Within that, I work in the evaluation part. So I speak not from the experience of private sector like my other colleagues, but primarily from the perspective of evaluations. And as Tim introduced, we just concluded, or in the recent past concluded, a evaluation of the GCF's private sector portfolio, which gives me some comments about the GCF's performance. Just very quickly on the mandate of the GCF, it's obviously serves the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, but the mandate, like Chris said, the mandate of the CIFs was very clear, but the mandate of the GCF is far wider. We once counted 18 different mandates within the mandate of the GCF. And the focus of the private sector, related parts of the mandate include at least 5 different dimensions: channeling private finance, including catalyzing it, a country-driven finance, balance in the geography and the thematic, so the adaptation and mitigation balance, to be effective and efficient, and to focus on the needs of the vulnerable countries, including the SIDS, the small island developing states, and the least developed countries, the LDCs. So those are the five, at least the 5 dimensions of the private sector related mandate of the GCF on which we assess the performance of the GCF. And I can speak about that a bit later.
Great, thanks, Archie. Look forward to hearing some of the findings from the evaluation efforts recently. And to Camilla.
Yes, hello everyone, great to be here. From our end, I'm Camilla, I'm working at the Green Jobs program of the International Labour Organization, which is the UN specialized agency on employment and labor issues. An important point to note is that we are a tripartite organization, so our constituents are not just governments, but also trade unions and employers organizations. So we do have the private sector as part of our governing body and global conference. For us, the angle on climate change is in its nexus to the world of work, because while we know, of course, that there are massive impacts coming from changes on climate on labor markets and employment, and we have millions of people threatened to be plunged into poverty in the next decades. At the same time, climate action will have very deep repercussions for labor market and certain elements of social progress and social development. So our take on climate change is to make sure that climate ambition is matched with decent work and social justice. And therefore, the notion of just transition is trying to bring those goals together, managing trade-offs, but also leveraging the win-wins that can be optimized in this transformations towards carbon neutrality. In terms of our work, our entry points are typically, of course, engagement and international processes, be the UNFCCC, G20, G7, and so forth. But also support and capacity building to countries in developing policies and plans for a just transition. More and more, we are seeing requests from countries to back up transition policies and investment with scaled up financial resources. And that's our second entry point. So collaborating with our programs on social finance is to work with financial sector actors to entrench and embed a just transition logic in their strategies and operations. So very much looking forward to this conversation happening today. Thank you.
Right, thanks you all. So in terms of framing for this conversation, one of the things we talked about doing was kind of, in the last webinar, we talked a lot about what needs to happen, and we wanted to shift today to explore the how. I think there's a lot of agreement about the need for scale, the need for focusing on justice and just transitions as well. And so just really wanted to explore some of the early lessons and insights that are emerging that you see that makes sense to pay attention to that. Just how do we do this? Maybe Shilpa, would you be willing to kick us off and just kind of share any reflections you have from the work that you've been involved with Climateworks and other foundations about what it's going to take and how we can really make progress?
So the one thing I'll say is that I'm not sure that the different sources of capital and their requirements, or really rather the constraints under which those different sources of capital operate, are well understood. I think there are many misconceptions. For example, one that I hear constantly when I talk to philanthropic foundations about working with the World Bank or another MDB is, oh, these are very deep-pocketed institutions. Why do they need philanthropic support? And I think that this sort of lack of understanding of what each source of capital is able to do, I think is a bit of a hindrance to working collaboratively to scale these blended finance structures. The other thing I've realized is that, blended finance structures don't just come walking in through the door. I think they need to be created, or should I say co-created, with the different providers of capital. And these things take time, unfortunately. So you need all stakeholders to be at the table and feel ownership. But then the more you are, the more time it takes.
Thanks, Shilpa. Great points, and I do want to circle back later to the second one you made there about other ways to reduce the transaction costs of what it takes to set up these blended finance structures, so we're not reinventing the wheel every time. But Chris, maybe turn to you for a minute to see from the CIF, your perspective and the CIF, are some of the early lessons that you're learning about kind of what it takes to make these kind of blended finance approaches work to really scale?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I mean, it's a really interesting question. It's something we're kind of looking at every day, right? Because that's kind of what we look at on the day-to-day is, how do you kind of get the biggest bang for the buck with fairly scarce resources, which is concessional finance, right? It's a pretty small pot of public resources, and there's an opportunity cost there. If you don't, if you use it here, you're not using it there. So we worked with a couple of years back, we worked with Bloomberg New Energy Finance to look at this specifically on energy sector, clean energy sector. With a focus on middle income countries. Kind of how is the concessional finance being used? What are some lessons? What's working? Maybe what's a bit of a challenge? And I'll just share a few of those kind of key summaries because it really gets to the how, kind of the on the ground and kind of what they saw. So first, they found that concessional finance can indeed kind of increase this rapid uptake of clean energy technologies in emerging markets. So that's it's kind of been demonstrated there. There's some interesting case studies from Mexico and Morocco and some others to go into detail kind of the how. Second, they found, similar to what Shilpa was just saying, it's flexibility and agility can be key here because the markets, they can change pretty quickly. And there's some bespoke structures that need to be set up. And so being able to have resources where you can adjust deployment strategies for how to use a concessional finance and kind of this willingness to take chances, to take some technology risks, take a bit of implementation risk, stuff like that can pay off. Third, they found is kind of like conceptually with concessional finance and how do you kind of use it in country with renewables specifically, they found that applying concessional finance to renewables can reduce what's called the levelized cost of energy, the LCOE of that renewables to where it makes them more competitive with existing fossil fuel assets like existing coal or existing gas or even new build coal or gas, sometimes by a number of years. So what they found with India, for example, they said, if you apply concessional finance, it can accelerate the point in time when a new wind plant becomes cheaper than running an existing coal or gas plant by 4 years. And so it really shows some kind of tangible, like, yeah, you can accelerate that pretty quickly by using, the specific tool or this resource. Fourth, they found, kind of unsurprisingly, and probably some we'll get to, enabling environment is critical, government policies and regulations, as well as the experience of the clean energy providers in the country. It's not just policy, it's also kind of who's in the market and kind of their familiarity and experience in the market. And fifth, something we weren't really expecting, which is the concessional capital can have a greater impact on the cost competitiveness of costlier technologies. So in other words, the higher the CapEx of a technology, the bigger kind of bang for the buck concessional finance can have. And they highlighted energy storage as an example. It's pretty expensive, or at least was, prices are coming down, but you can kind of get a big impact there versus technologies that have a higher like operating cost or operating expense. So something that I think we want to follow up and kind of look at some more technologies on, but I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Chris. Archie, I'd love to hear just a kind of brief overview of some of the key findings that were really struck you as being relevant to this conversation from the recent GCF evaluation on private sector mobilization.
Thanks, Tim. Maybe I'll just address the key findings that I was thinking about as I was listening to Chris and Shilpa. So Shilpa, I'll put it so eloquently that we need to know what different actors are supposed to do. And sometimes you might perceive that the expectations from the GCF are similar to those from the World Bank or the CIFs, but the mandate is actually quite very different. The GCF was obviously established a little bit later than the CIFs, and the mandate focuses very clearly on, at least in our interpretation and the interpretation of the evaluation, on the needs of the vulnerable countries, on local actors, medium-sized enterprises, and things like that, which then direct you to enabling environments and going into high-risk areas and taking risks and with a high-risk appetite. But we found in our evaluation that the portfolio of the GCF is actually very similar to the MDBs, particularly the CIFs. So the large part of the private sector portfolio of the GCF, and how we define it is another story because there clearly is no definition of the private sector portfolio. But if we look at what's the private sector facility portfolio, it's similar to the CIFS portfolio, focused largely on energy and similar contexts as well, similar geographies as well. And therefore, we were asking ourselves, what is the mandate of the GCF? One of the things we're saying, we were finding is that in the GCF language, in the strategies and the guidance provided by the board, the terms mobilizing and catalyzing are used interchangeably, but they mean very different things. So mobilizing would mean leverage and co-finance, etc. But to be catalyzing, which is actually the mandate of the fund, you need to take risks. You need to enter new and emerging markets. You need to focus on SIDS and LDCs where private sector may not otherwise go on its own, and then use this public finance to open and create enabling environments, create policy changes, use grants if that might be essential. The GCF has as many instruments as the SIDS, but it could focus on the use of grants to create that subsequently that private sector investment. That was one of the key things that excited me. Of course, there are many others that I can come back to later in the conversation.
That sounds great. And Camilla, I wanted to pose the question I started with before about kind of what are we learning? What are some of the early insights that are coming from work? And I think it sounds like the ILO has been at this for some time, really thinking about how to scale finance for the social programs. And just curious what insights you have from that work to date about what it's going to take and what's working.
Yeah, so the first thing I should say is that the sort of just addressing the just dimension in a comprehensive way in terms of climate finance is still in its early days. Yeah. So I would say that one of the key ingredients is really having a common understanding of what just means, because we are seeing quite a great divergence. So we have a lot of commitments around just transition or inclusive climate action and so on, but it can mean very different things. And while I think it's great news that everybody is taking on the social dimension of climate action, I think we really need to develop this common understanding and notions of what really this means in practice, because this will help in alignment. And this is very important also for aligning financial flows. Having a common understanding would also enable you to establish sound metrics that are really important in terms for reporting and for monitoring progress and for setting targets that are credible. And in that regards, there has been some work done by the World Benchmarking Alliance, for instance, in terms of an assessment of just transition at company level, and we're doing something for national level policies. And coming into policy, I think it was mentioned by Chris earlier, enabling a regulatory and policy environment are really key, because they allow a certain coherence. Because I think what's happening a lot in the field of climate policy and climate investment, and in the context of social investment, is that you have a lot of scattered approach. And this means kind of dispersing a little bit efforts and having some missed of opportunities in terms of convergence and impact. So having plans and instruments from the government level and at the voluntary level that helps to frame and structure objectives and priorities would really manage to leverage and optimize the use of resources and orient them in the most effective ways.
Thanks. I see Mike's got a question in the chat, which I'll come back to in a minute, and also want to encourage other participants to feel free to chat in questions. We'll have more time a little bit later in the conversation to really explore some of those. What I'd like to do now, though, is just to unpack something, Chris and Camilla, that you both referenced, is the enabling policy environment that kind of can really enable scaling and blended finance structures. And I wondered if you just wanted to open it up for any of the panelists to share thoughts on kind of what are some key ingredients of that type of enabling policy environment. I mean, I know we've heard the value of certainty about how things get moved, but are there other kind of dimensions of that, or kind of examples you can point to of the types of policies or factors that are important for that enabling environment? Anybody want to go first?
I can take a stab at it, Tim. So I think that there need to be climate-friendly policies, right? If we can't have a price on carbon, then at the very least, I think there shouldn't be subsidies on fossil fuels, because that just goes against what we are trying to what we're trying to do in terms of decarbonization. And then I think if we're talking about the private sector, there have to be business-friendly policies. There have to be a business-friendly enabling environment that can attract investment in general. And in that, I would include enforcement of laws and regulations, because oftentimes you find that, you know, there are all these wonderful regulations on the books, but if they're not enforced, then you're not going to create the certainty that you talked about and a sort of a stable environment. So these are just very obvious things, but I think it's sad that we have to keep repeating them in order to sort of make the point. Now, at Climateworks, I think we work mostly on the more upstream types of issues, such as policies and regulations to facilitate decarbonization. But I think that there is a very big role for other institutions like the MDBs, for instance, to really be focusing on some of these other ecosystem building enabling conditions.
Great. Camilla, from your perspective at the ILO, just curious if there's certain enabling policy conditions that you see as particularly important or have been working to help build in different contexts.
Yeah, so building on what Shilpa was saying, I think clearly credible and ambitious climate policies are key, but I would add that you would really need coherence and integration across a range of policy fields, because if you have taxations and macroeconomic policies or industrial policies that kind of contradict those goals, we are going to get stuck, right? So you really need policy coherence across the board. And from a just transition perspective, this also means looking at policies in the labor field, be it in terms of skills development, in that job-rich investments, social protection, occupational health and safety, rights at work. So you really need to make sure you've got a set of policy instruments that are well aligned. The second point that I think is important to align is that these policies need to be based on social dialogue and stakeholder engagements, because, and I believe this is also a really important ingredient to transformational change in general, because sometimes consultations and dialogues are believed to slow things down because they do take time. But in fact, the risk of having just top-down approaches is much bigger, because you risk derailing those very policies and ambitious actions by getting a pushback and a backlash. So I would say that as part of this enabling environment, you need to have policies that are based on dialogue and stakeholder engagement, where private sector, civil society and unions are sitting at the table, because that will allow you to leverage a broad-based consensus that is what's needed.
Archie, from the recent evaluation experience, any reflections on the enabling context and what it takes there?
Absolutely, Tim. Actually, most of what we found, what it takes to get to enabling environment, was from the experience of colleagues in the room and others, because the GCF portfolio is still quite young, and we didn't have enough evidence from the GCF's portfolio. But just on the effectiveness of the GCF to then reach and create those enabling environments, I could speak on that just a little bit. The focus on adaptation, that's part of the mandate of the GCF. We were finding that even as of now, as a public institution, the GCF's private sector portfolio at that time, which is last year, had only about a little over $40 million investment in adaptation, which is 1.4% of the GCF portfolio at that time. That's very limited, right? So enabling environments are very crucial, of course, but even more difficult in the adaptation space, where public sector institutions are in fact mandated to go in and create those environments. So that's particularly challenging. Another challenge we found related to enabling environments was capacities, especially in the geographies and the contexts where public institutions such as the GCF are asked to focus. If you take the example of SIDS and LDCs, governments especially would have such limited capacities, just as one of our respondents calls it, bums in seats. You just don't have enough officials, enough staff in a lot of the ministries to work on such change or the longevity, which we also found quite challenging as well. And on enabling environments, again, I can turn to something that Chris said, which was about the mandate of the SIFs was to bring something that's the edge of commercial viability to viability. But the mandate of the GCF goes a little bit beyond to go to context where private sector would otherwise not be attracted to at all. And their enabling environments relate to, again, capacity, but also we were finding related to knowledge about the opportunities. And once the knowledge is there, the knowledge of the ability to use the technical capacity to use those instruments. And that's where also the public finance could be used to bring those actors into the mainstream.
Great. And Chris, I know that you and the SIF have been thinking a lot about this and are providing more technical assistance to kind of help create effective enabling environments for finance. And just want to see if you have any thoughts on kind of key insights emerging from that work about what are those key pieces that need to be put in place to really enable financing to scale and flow?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's something that, just kind of from a high level, I mean, things are going on the right track when it comes to policy.
Rare when the grantees are losing
Okay,
funds.
folks could please mute yourself if you're not speaking. Thank you.
So just looking at some data, I think as of early 2020, only a third of global emissions were covered by like net zero commitments. And right before Glasgow, that was up to 80%. And right after Glasgow, that was almost 90%. So, kind of broadly, governments are moving in that direction. But there's some interesting data from ClimateScope that showed for renewable energy in particular, that they surveyed about 100 different countries, looked at what policies they had for renewables. 80% had a renewable energy target, which is great. But the more specific kind of policies to Shilpa's kind of point, like they're lacking, the details and kind of getting into it. How do you do it was kind of lacking. So one example we saw, at least in Kazakhstan, where we went in with EBRD and IFC, kind of in the 2010, 2011, with just $1 million of a technical assistance grant to go in and work with the government on building out a policy. It was not just kind of a broad renewable energy policy, but it looked at things like power purchase agreements. How do you standardize those? How do you get the feed-in tariff structure set up? There's a cost clearing and settlement center. So all like the different mechanics and pieces kind of set up at the policy level with the government, with the regulator, et cetera. So we kind of set that kind of foundation up. And then right after that, we came in with about $50 million for the first solar plant, one of the first wind farms, and kind of built it like that. And then some additional follow-on investment came. GCF came in with a big follow-on investment after that to really take it to the next level. So that was kind of an interesting way, I think, to Camilla's point, it took time. There was a lot of stakeholders there, and to get it right, they kind of had to go back and tweak the policy, this and that, but kind of putting it on that direction, kind of on that pathway. On the policy side, then following up with some of the first investments to kind of demonstrate that commercial sustainability, I thought was a pretty interesting example.
Great. I mean, what I'm taking from this conversation is you really need to think about a whole range of different, probably country-specific enabling conditions and factors at different levels, from national commitments and kind of alignment and coherence across policy frameworks to way even down to things like procurement of systems and processes and siting, if you're talking about renewable energy and how those things work. And so it does seem like a complex task, but one where there's probably opportunities to really learn across geographies and to provide that type of assistance. I wanted to turn to, there's some comments in the chat. Mike Ward and Rob Vandenberg have both referenced this, and it's something that I think we're seeing some really exciting examples. This idea, back to Shilpa's point, of we need people to come together and to build these structures where investment can flow into, that really enable blended finance. And we're seeing lots of interesting ones emerge. I think back in December, Bill Weil from Tempest Advisors talked about CSEF, which is a Southeast Asia fund. There's exciting work in different geographies to set up new funds that may have blended finance, or that a range of different investors could put money into. And I think this idea that if you create those structures, that there is capital that's looking to make a difference. And so just curious to see your thoughts on kind of are there examples of places where we've been able to successfully set up those structures where you see kind of capital moving in exciting ways? And any reflections on kind of what it takes to set up those kind of vessels or mechanisms? Anyone want to kick us off on that?
Well, Tim, I feel like I don't I feel like I'm always the first to respond to your call, but let me build on what you said about, you know, what Bill Weil referred to in the previous webinar. And I think that CSEF and other project preparation types of facilities, I think, is an approach that we've also implemented. And it's really to help investors improve their project preparation to increase what I call the climate credentials of their projects. And we have examples of this. Cooling is one example, that one area that I've worked on. Space cooling or refrigeration. Now, that's a high and growing user of energy. It also has a nefarious climate impact through the refrigerant gases that are used. Now, there are lower GWP options, just as there is an opportunity to increase the energy efficiency of cooling solutions. But, you know, going beyond business as usual requires technical inputs and specialized project preparation, both of which take time and are costly. And one approach that we've tried, and that I think has been fairly successful, is to work with different types of financial intermediaries, the entities that actually have the money to invest, and to help them defray some of these additional costs. So for example, we seeded an efficient clean cooling program at ESMAP. This is the World Bank's energy sector TA facility. And this has enabled ESMAP to raise awareness of cooling efficiency, as well as incorporate higher efficiency cooling choices in bank operations. We've also worked with private funds to help them with additional project preparation in their industrial and commercial cooling projects, and to create a pipeline. I think the fact that, you know, I really feel that there is money to invest, but there aren't necessarily investable propositions in the number and scale and size that we need.
Great. Chris, I'm curious if there's any thoughts you have from the CIF perspective on this topic.
No, thanks. I mean, building up just what Shilpa was saying, I mean, there's kind of a question out there on these blended finance structures, not necessarily at the project level, but kind of what we say more at the fund level. Like, how do you bring in really large amounts of institutional or commercial capital and pair that with public money to then kind of deploy through these projects in developing countries? And it's kind of speaking with both sides of those groups. A lot of commercial investors, institutional investors, whatnot, are very interested in doing more. They're getting a lot of pressure from their shareholders, from policy, from whatnot. And to Shilpa's point, there just haven't been that many real avenues or like mechanisms or structures they can invest in. And all those different investors, there's differences in what they can invest in, the risk they can take. They like seeing plain vanilla stuff, nothing too bespoke. But and often these structures, as they're developed, they do become a bit more bespoke and kind of specific. But it's kind of, the more of those structures I think that we can see out there. We've seen a few. There's the BlackRock Climate Finance Partnership. Rockefeller Foundation's working on a big one. We've been looking at some structures ourselves. So kind of, how do you bring that institutional capital in more? How do you get them more, comfortable with emerging markets, and not just like middle income emerging markets, but even lower income emerging markets where they really haven't done that much work before. How do you get the pipeline? How do you get kind of the ESG considerations built in there? And that's all really important. It's something that I think that we can make a lot of advancement on fairly soon. And then there's a public side, which is kind of getting the public sector capital and donors and governments and others kind of comfortable with that too. How do they put their money with the private sector? Who takes what risk? How does reporting work? Stuff like that. So even though we haven't seen a lot kind of out there, I think that this is a really big opportunity here in the next few years.
Great. And I think that you mentioned the Rockefeller Initiative. I'm just going to put a link to that in the chat. The Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is an interesting new philanthropic initiative. Camilla, I'm curious if you've had any experience with the ILO and thinking about that kind of, do we have enough investable projects? What does it take for project preparation to really take advantage of financing? And I don't know if that's an issue or challenge that you've come up against in the ILO experience for scaling, or just any reflections on kind of how to build these types of investment platforms in efficient ways.
Yeah, I think it's an important, the notion of platform is an important one because you are dealing with rather complex dynamics. So it has to be a bit of a matching of supply and demand, because on the one hand, on the investor side, you can be very opportunistic, right? But on the other hand, it's also important to.
If folks could mute themselves, please. Thanks. Looks like we've got that muted.
Yeah, it's also important to have a bit of a critical mass, right, to orient investments into a specific country or into specific regions. And I think in that regard, I think it was put in the chat some examples on the just transition mechanism in Europe, or the just transition partnership for South Africa are an interesting one. And the interesting piece is also that they go at subnational level, because given that we are dealing with pretty complex issues and a wide range of investment types to bring about a just transition, if you narrow it down, at least by geography, you're able to better frame what kind of priorities you have, and then have a number of, let's say, baskets to be filled, right, by different types of investments that can be fulfilled by investors with different mandates and investees with different level of maturities. But I think to put the puzzle together, a nice starting point to simplify things could be really to go down to national and sub-regional reality. So kind of place-based approach, I think, makes the difference in terms of bringing together supply and demand in a way that really makes sense.
Thanks. I do want to come back to that in a minute, because I think there's a strong link there between enabling kind of just approaches, getting money down to where it really matters at the local level. But I did want to create space, Archie, if there's anything you'd like to add to this kind of round of conversation here.
Thanks, Tim. Just to add also, perhaps, we're talking of opportunities. Rob was talking in the chat about opportunities, and so was Matt. And if I could speak just a little bit about the opportunity cost of accessing public finance, such as the GCF, and we were finding in our evaluation that perhaps this could be a finding, is that if the opportunity has a cost of time and money. So GCF is very difficult to access. We were finding it takes up to 750 days to get accredited to the GCF. So GCF needs accreditation before you can apply for funds. It takes over 700 days to get accredited, and then it takes over 200 days to get the project from application to approval by the board. And I'm not talking about legal negotiations here. So it can take up to 3 years to get the first dollar out of the GCF, which is a shock to a lot of private sector actors. And right away, and let me talk about cost also very quickly, because one of our respondents found that for preparation of a GCF project, it takes them per country up to $400,000 per project per country. So if you have a project covering 3 countries, it'll take you $400,000 additional over your normal cost of project preparation to apply for a project for the GCF. That's obviously a deterrent to many private sector actors, and it's a shock in terms of time and money, and it drives away a lot of the actors, or at least discourages them. And so that cost also has to be accounted for in the design of public finance institutions, which then have this mandate to create spaces for private finance.
Great. Going back to Camilla, your point about kind of thinking subnationally, and I'm just curious, any of your reflections on, as climate finance or finance mobilizes to address climate solutions, including for adaptation and resilience, what's it going to take to get money down to the community level in ways that really kind of enable just transitions and affect people and livelihoods in ways that, I think that there's a real challenge between the wholesale and retail. And curious any reflections you have about where you see that working, or what it's going to take, or where we're at in that regard.
So I think it goes back to a point that was made earlier, I think by Shilpa, on like really being clear about what kind of investment spaces are we talking about. Because there will be different instruments that are appropriate for different types of investments. And frankly speaking, there's certain areas of just transition, like universal social protection, where public money is just key, right? And while if we keep visualize a coal community in a coal phase out kind of settings, there are other types of investment where blended finance solutions are going to make the difference. If we talk about renewable energy, for instance, from a just transition perspective, it would be important that investments don't just go into hard infrastructure, but they also go into people. And therefore, when you develop a renewable energy project, you're building a component that it's about skills development. So in a way, through a project approach, you're gonna reach communities and workers themselves. At the same time, what I think makes an even bigger difference is when you have structures that align these different efforts. So again, if we imagine this core community, if you've got a strategy for skills development, either at sectoral or at subnational level, then efforts by different private sector actors and MDBs and municipal governments and so forth can be aligned, and then there's a greater narrative. And when we think about economic diversification, so there you can bring in conventional investments, right, to push the area to diversify. But then in order to maximize the job and the dividends for the local economy, it would be important to have, for instance, technical assistance when it comes to suppliers. So to maximize, a revitalization of the local economy there, or to ensure access to finance to MSMEs in the supply chain. And I think again, there's different types of financial institutions that can act at different segments in order to make that happen.
Great. Any other reflections from the panel on kind of getting resources down to the grassroots level to fund either anything from microfinance to other efforts? Chris, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, that's kind of one idea. Some things we've seen in our portfolio, kind of ways to do that. And of course, it can be challenging, especially for these kind of larger institutions like multilateral development banks that usually have pretty big ticket sizes to get that finance down to the MSME level, and particularly through the private sector. I mean, one way that we've been able to do that in some sectors has been through working with local banks, local financial intermediaries. So, provide a loan to a local bank. And critically, not just the money, but also the TA and the kind of skills training and developing within those banks. So for example, with energy efficiency, how do they train their credit officers, all over the country, how to assess like an energy efficiency project or climate resilience project, right? How do you kind of bake that into normal kind of business operations? And how do you kind of market and sell it as a new business opportunity and a growth kind of opportunity for that bank, again, with competitive advantage? Right, those things put together, like you provide the sweetener with the concessional finance, but also kind of the skills development, kind of the training and the TA, both from like the credit officer level, but also like to the broader bank itself. Just at a project in Turkey where we provided support for corporate governance stuff to kind of help alongside the lending practices. And this is an approach that also you've seen work for climate adaptation in particular, which is pretty difficult to do in many cases. And so by providing this funding to local banks, we saw it in Tajikistan through a project with EBRD, they can support kind of smaller scale, water projects, land management project pumps, stuff like that, that can improve the adaptation and resilience of local communities and do so in a way that you can kind of scale up, at least on that kind of local level.
Great. Shilpa or Archie, any thoughts you'd like to share on this? I wanted to come back and then, well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge there's a really active chat right now with some really great thoughts being shared and some examples too of where there's some exciting work going on. I will turn to some of the participant questions and reflections in a few minutes here, but I did want to come back to Shilpa, you raised the point at the beginning about, the challenges that a lot of these different, sectors don't have a clear understanding of each other and how they work in the context of finance. And then I think we've also heard in this discussion that the financing structure needs can vary on different types of investments. If you're looking at utility scale renewable energy projects versus local resilience work, involving farmers, or so there's quite a diversity. So what's it going to take to to help build these relationships and understanding across philanthropic, public, private sector actors? And is there any things that can really just lower the transaction costs for kind of enabling that understanding and building some governance structures around these platforms that can be robust and useful? And how do we scale this number of platforms? I know there's a lot in there, but just curious about kind of any thoughts you have on kind of next steps that are needed over the coming years here to really build this kind of vision.
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental question, isn't it? Is how do we get these different sources of capital and these different providers of support to really understand what the limitations of each source or each entity could be, and I think having more opportunities for people to actually invest the time to understand, that the GCF can do certain things, but here's what you need to know about what it might best be able to do. Philanthropy can provide support here, but frankly, not so much over here. Those kinds of understandings, I think, just take time and investment in relationships. But I do want to talk a little bit about these transaction costs, because they are frankly high. And I think this is a conundrum that continues to plague climate investment. And I don't have the solution, but we need to figure out a way to make transactions more easily replicable, cookie cutter, if you will. And perhaps we need to double down on figuring out how to standardize contracts, how to standardize underwriting criteria in order to deploy funds quickly and at scale. In other words, I think we need a wholesale approach, but even things that are packaged and sold as wholesale facilities tend to have a lot of, for want of a better word, micromanagement that happens on the part of the people who've funded that facility. And I think all too often, good governance is interpreted as strong involvement on the part of the funder, whoever that funder might be, I think, which then ends up leading to practically a retail approach.
Great thoughts. Anyone else have thoughts they want to share on the panel for this? And then after this, I'm going to turn to some of the participant questions. Okay. I will come back to you all before we wrap up, because I do have a closing question for each of you. But I'd like to turn now just to some of the participants. There's been a really lively chat. I know Rob Vandenberg and Matt Savage have raised some questions and shared some thoughts. I wanted to see, Rob or Matt, if either of you have a quick comment that you'd like to make, kind of building off what you've been sharing in the chat, or a question for the panelists. Feel free to unmute and come on in. Rob.
I think that the problems that were raised by the panel were really key problems, and very good to hear your perspectives on these. And so I admire the power of thinking, so to say, in this panel. And if we can solve the paradox or the challenge that Shilpa Patel formulated of better understanding of one another, then it can actually be done. And the problem is here that we are also fighting against general ideological ideas, which are basically saying that the private sector should work on its own and should not have support of the public sector, because that will actually distort the market. So it's wrong to do. And on the other hand, the public sector should not, the private sector should not take over public functions. And there is often a misunderstanding on all of this. I would very much recommend reading Mariano Mazzucato on the issues of public investment in technology innovation or infrastructure and technology development in general. And there are, I believe, a huge number of lessons to be learned from that for the specific problems that you are facing. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Matt, did you have any questions you want to raise for the panel or reflections on the chat?
Yeah, I mean, just a reflection. I think most of the points have been covered, but one thing I would like to say is that in general, the climate funds and the IFIs are set up to compete against each other for limited pools of opportunities rather than to collaborate. And they tend to be demand driven, so sort of led by sort of local country priorities. And with blended finance, it really requires a completely different mentality where you're encouraging collaboration and cooperation between the sources of finance, and sort of pooling of resource, and that requires a sort of quite a senior political direction, which may not be embedded in the processes of the funds and the IFIs themselves. So you're always having to go back up the chain to get the management to say, this is a good idea, let's bring ourselves together and let's do something more transformative. But that's not naturally in the DNA of the financing infrastructure, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Wanted to check with Mike Ward. Mike, you had posted some early questions, and just, I know we've covered some aspects of some of those, but just wanted to see if you had any follow-up questions for the panel.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks to the whole panel for some really amazing insights. I think that the one thing that really strikes me, and I'm trying to find my way through it a little bit, is that when you get everybody in the same room, everybody agrees that they need to work together. They agree on what needs to be done. They agree that they're going to play different roles. So all of that, everybody is agreed on. And yet it seems so difficult to get everybody to kind of commit to a shared project or a shared piece of work. And so, yeah, just, I suppose, a question about how best we navigate that. How do we support people to find each other? Is it kind of policy frameworks that need to be put in place? Is it kind of financing agreements? Yeah, just thoughts around how best we move beyond this total agreement on what needs to be done, and yet the real difficulty in doing it.
Yeah, how do you build those trust relationships? And any reflections from the panelists?
Tim, if I could just
go ahead,
come in on that. Actually, Mike, that's an interesting observation, and one that I might not completely agree with. The reason I say this is because once we staged our evaluation to the board of the GCF, we got some disagreement, some agreement, and quite sharp at that, which is great for an evaluation, because it's great for an evaluation that the board can disagree or disagree, which makes the position of the board explicit, which is better than an unstated position. But particularly on the dimension of whether the GCF is a catalyzing fund or a mobilizing fund, the developed country constituencies and the developing country constituencies quite divided, which is interesting. But which also told us that while we agree on the direction of travel, all of us agree that climate change needs to be, we are all here because we want to address climate change. We all agree that private sector, the private finance is key, and that direction of travel is absolutely certain. How that travel will happen is not clear. How that journey should happen, who do we take along? Is it the developed country? Is it the LDCs and the SIDS? Is it the fruit seller on the side of the road in a small island country? Or should we focus instead on the large ready investments? what the quality of that travel would be. I'm not sure that there's as much agreement there as one might wish. And because, again, I'm coming from the evaluation perspective, I might suggest that we might need to, all of us in this room and beyond, take our evidence, take our knowledge, take the TCLP, the knowledge partnerships, and bring that into activism. I say that because multilateral institutions, Paris Agreement, UNFCCC would set signals for a lot of us. We all use Paris Agreement in setting, sort of describing the directions of our work, and then working or advocating with the decision makers who then have a seat at the table while creating those signals, basically using our knowledge, our evidence to be some activists in our ample free time, and work with those decision makers to then provide those channels and those guidance from the top, from the very top. That could be one interesting approach as well, to translate this knowledge into active action.
Thanks, Archie. Camilla?
Acknowledging the challenge, I think, and the transaction costs that were mentioned earlier, I think it might be worthwhile to start building like kind of small coalition of the willing, right? That so a small set of institutions that are starting already with some kind of alignment are willing to put in the time and to already have some basis of trust, trying out, what kind of a more standardized approach or key references and so forth can be, and work it out in this kind of small reference group, rather than, I think, from the start having these massive platforms. Not to be exclusive, obviously, but it's just to make progress and to make a dent. Sometimes it's you kind of come up with solutions in a linear way if we start small, and then you scale it up when you've got something to start with. So that's just a suggestion that perhaps could be interesting to explore based on countries, based on sectors, based on institutional affiliations, and so forth.
Yeah, and it seems like along those lines, the more models that we have about that we can make work, then it will be easier to scale and replicate some of those types of platforms. I saw that Jed Lee had a hand up, and just wanted to see if you wanted to get in with a question or quick comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Jed Stephen Kinney, and I represent the African Youth Peer Review Committee in Liberia. Our thematics areas are in good governance, policies, advocacies. But there are issues, we all are fighting climate change condition to create better environment for the world, especially for the next generation that are coming. But there are issues, especially with international organizations. For example, we are in Liberia. We are all fighting climate change. Sometimes we're having programs. We invite international organizations to attend. It becomes a problem. They are not willing to identify, even if they see your effort. For example, recently we were having a program at the Capitol building with the parliamentarians, calling on parliamentarians to sign a resolution for fossil fuel free future. We invited so many international organizations, they didn't show up. Sometimes you write them for support, no support. So how can we defeat climate change? This is my question. Thank you.
Any panel reflections on that? I think one of the things I took away from that is just the disconnect, I think, between a lot of the capital being mobilized and that actually reaching the ground and making a difference, where it really, people see that impact. And maybe just want to see if that spurs any thoughts on kind of like the just dimension of getting climate finance down to the communities? I know we've talked some about that, but anything that any of you want to add?
I think we have a tendency to want climate finance to solve all problems. And I think that we can't, it's not everything. There's no one size fits all here, right? And and as I said earlier, I think different providers of capital and different institutions bring different perspectives to an issue. And I think that we burden, in trying to please too many constituencies around a specific intervention, we end up sinking that intervention or making it take 700 days to get accredited, or whatever. And I think we need to sort of be a little bit more humble about what different institutions and different entities are actually going to be able to do.
Great, thanks, Shilpa. I see two additional hands raised. What I'd love to do is maybe just turn to those two participants to in sequence get their questions on the table and then turn those back to you all. So Guli, I wonder if you could share your question, and then we'll go to Matt.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation, very insightful remarks by all of the panelists. I'm Guli Sabahi. I'm Senior Advisor on Climate Finance at NDC Partnership. We are a coalition of governments and intergovernmental institutions, including all MDBs and various UN agencies and civil society actors. So we are focusing right now on NDC implementation. We're working with countries to develop their NDC implementation plans. And based on those, help countries devise their investment planning and financing strategies. And I was just going to make a comment about the importance of these financing strategies, multi-stakeholder financing models, to be country-driven. And I was wondering, whether, like one of the things that I see in my work, and I just joined the partnership 3 months ago, I come from the private sector, but there's a lot of good work that happens in the country. There are many programs and there is a lot of effort to coordinate. But I wonder, I think it was one of the speakers has mentioned that there's perhaps a need of having a framework or some sort of agreement, maybe at the country level, to bring all of the relevant stakeholders and the appropriate universe of investors to focus on, financing strategies for specific portfolio of projects, maybe by sector. I think that would be very key. We have right now, through the member support, have worked with countries to identify a number of NDC aligned projects. So these are mitigation and adaptation projects that would help countries to meet their NDC targets. And they're different sizes, they're different level of maturity, and the governments need help to figure out how to, what financing instruments to use, whether it should be green bonds, blended finance, or other types of instruments, how they should be even going about developing those projects to make them investable, to Shilpa's, point, like we need more of those investable projects. And I very much also like the comment that Camille made about, how can we go smaller and then scale that up? Maybe, it's important not to go too ambitiously in trying to create this massive platforms. I mean, we are a massive platform and we have done a lot of amazing work, but their challenges remain. And so I just wanted to highlight this importance of the country-driven approach to bring together all the relevant stakeholders in devising those finance strategies. Thank you.
Thanks, Guli, and thanks for joining the conversation. Let me, Matt, go quickly to you, and then I'm going to turn back for some closing thoughts from the panel.
Great, thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone, for your comments and insights. My name's Matt Spanegal. I'm working for the And Green Fund, which is a blended loan facility. So on our investor side, we're talking to public and private investors, but we deal with private sector companies in the agriculture and forest protection space in developing countries. So we see both sides of the challenge. a 3-year time lead and a 500K plus transaction cost is just a non-starter for the private sector if they're not certain of the outcome. If you know you're going to get over the hurdle at the end, you know, they're willing to invest. But if it's uncertain right up to the board meeting of the GCF, for example, then, you know, they're just not interested. It's not possible. So organizations like ours can provide some of that bridge, but it's difficult for us to manage that transaction cost as well. So I put some of this comment in some of this question in my comment, but I liked Guli's focus on nationally driven, and I wondered if it would be possible for public sector organizations to really embrace the NDC country-driven idea. For example, if a country has, this is our policy platform, these are the sectors and strategies that we want to draw funding into, in which sort of instruments, then if between the public sector institutions, the CS, the GCF, you know, UNFCCC instruments, are able to take those strategies and actually put them proactively on their platforms. You know, this is what we want to invest in, rather than, you know, for those of us applying to these things, you know, you're constantly coming to and trying to fit into what the public sector institutions have, rather than, and then trying to convert that into what the countries need. It's difficult to do. So it's a question, I think it goes to the earlier comment around retail products. How can we make our financing products more, you know, ready for implementation in that retail sense? We'd love to hear more about that. Thanks. That was longer than I meant it to be, but thank you for your insights.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Any very quick reflections on that from the panel, and or feel free to chat in any thoughts on that as well, including other participants. Chris?
Yeah, I just kind of briefly step in on something I think that touches on Matt, your comment, also Guli's comment, which is one approach we've taken that seems to be fairly effective in these considerations is something called an investment plan, where we will go with multiple MDBs into a country, work with multiple ministries and CSOs and others, focused on a specific kind of sector. I think that's important. So right now we have a program focused on renewable energy integration. So scoping missions going on with all these MDBs and other stakeholders focused on that specific question. And then what's going to come from that is going to be a plan focused on what that country wants to do in that sector. There's going to be some ideas for investment, some of which will be funded under the plan, some of which, you know, could be some additional opportunities for private sector to step in. And that's, you know, meant to be like an actionable plan. So, you know, we don't have all those, you know, plans in all those different countries and all those different sectors. It's pretty specific, but I think, you know, scaling that kind of approach up could be, you know, interesting to address those concerns. Thanks.
Great. This has really been a wonderful panel. We've got about 1.5 minutes left, and I wanted to give each of you kind of a lightning round of 20 seconds to just leave us with a thought of what you think is really important for this community to be thinking about and talking about over the coming months to really help make progress on these issues we've been talking about. So who would like to go first? How about Archie, you want to go?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Maybe I'll use my 20 seconds to address the NDCs question. And in our evaluation, we did that assessment of looking at the NDCs and comparing that with the private sector investment of the GCF. And we found that there was some modest coverage and overlap with the NDCs in the energy sector particularly. But there were other areas where the GCF was providing finance, which were not mentioned in the NDCs for most countries. And therefore we were recommending in our evaluation to basically create country ownership, as other panelists and other colleagues have said in the room. Really, country ownership is a very explicit part of the mandate of institutions of public finance anyway. And to focus on that, and NDCs could be one very interesting way to operationalize that and to find the synergy with NDCs. I'll stop
Thanks,
there.
Archie. Camilla?
Yes, just to build, I think, Chris points on the investment plans that are, in a way, they match, they bring together the financiers, MDBs, and national priorities. Makes a lot of sense. I think there's a bit of a disconnect between high-level NDCs and then projects. And I think these plans can be a meso-level type of support that would be very, very appreciated. just a thought on a topic that I think is increasing in importance, and that's transition finance. And that's something that has been picked up more and more. So not just focusing finance on low emitting and low carbon activities, but what do we do with abating in hard to in emission intensive sectors? And obviously there is a just transition element there. So maybe some food for thought for the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Shilpa?
Yeah, I think it's, I think so much interesting and good work is being done. And I'm not sure that, I think we focus on everything that needs to be done without really acknowledging what is being done. And I'm totally for, letting these 1,000 flowers bloom in some way and finding entry points. And I think so much of this depends on finding a person to work with to create these new structures. Because as I said earlier, they're not ready-made and one size isn't going to fit all. And I think finding like-minded people who are willing to invest in making those structures happen and in the relationships that I think are key to build the trust that can then allow things to blossom.
Thanks. And Chris, real quick, and then we'll turn to Sarah Moyne from the CIF.
Thanks. So I'll just build off what Shilpa said. I think, we need these kind of different ideas and different type of structures. In particular, how do we bring in the institutional capital? And there's a lot of kind of interest to do that. And I think there's going to be a lot of different kind of ideas bubble up. So trying to take those learnings as soon as possible. What works among others? Like, what are the investors looking for to really bring in that quantum that's needed? I think will be something to focus on.
Great, thanks. And thanks to all of you for a great conversation. Over to Sarah.
Thank you, Tim, and a huge thanks to all of our panelists again today for this excellent discussion on scaling and expanding the transformational impact of financing and really how best to make this happen and how best to leverage the resources that we have to reach that scale of transformational impact. As we move towards closing thoughts, we wanted to really share out a few of the TCLP's highlights from the past few months. In December, as was mentioned earlier, the TCLP held a webinar that explored the unique and intertwined roles that the public, private, and philanthropic investments can play in working together to sort of scale transformational climate action. So in other words, what needs to happen to scale and expand the transformational impact of financing. We also published a short brief providing an overview of the TCLP's work and its evolution since 2017. A transformational change case study was also published that looks at the progress in transforming Turkey's energy sector with support from the CIF's Clean Technology Fund. And moving forward, what we're really doing is operationalizing the use of these transformational change concepts to shape and guide investment plans in the new CIF programs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So over the short term, briefly, we have a joint resilience in landscapes and just transitions interest group webinar coming up on May 19th. The session will present insights from a case study in Ghana and really provide an opportunity to engage around transformational change tools and perspectives to enable just transitions and just resilience in natural resource and landscape management. We also have a transformational change concepts, methods, and metrics interest group call on June 30th to really sort of kick off the next phase of the TCLP's work. That includes an expanded focus on transformational change and evaluation and learning approaches. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining, and I really encourage you to participate in upcoming calls and opportunities for engagement. We will also be making the recording and some additional materials available on the TCLP's website following this event. So thank you again.